Well, hello and welcome to what is the 54th episode of the Adoption and Fostering podcast with me, Al Coates, and
me, Scott Casson-Reddy.
Who's feeling very infantile. Yeah, whatever.
Oh my God. I am feeling infantile actually tonight.
Excellent. Happy New Year, by the way.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Happy New Year. It's only we're only a week in, so it's still New Year, really,
It's
isn't
the
it?
8th. It's still technically the New Year. We
Yeah.
can still say Happy New Year. Did you Did you wear your kilt and do hogmanay? Is that what you do?
No, I was reserving the kilt for the wedding because it's obviously well, you know. Yeah. Anyway, that's
because you go big. I know you. Come on, imagine we're doing a podcast. Pep yourself up a bit. Come on, bit of banter, bit of
Oh my God.
New Year,
Sure.
new you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There is some elements. I just I'm sure that everybody will relate to exactly how we're feeling. It's just, it goes on forever, and then all of a sudden it's finished, and it's like you've crashed and burned, and then you go back to school and you're like, did the last 3 weeks really happen? In fact, the last 5 weeks, all the preparation and all the getting up to it and blah blah blah. And it's interesting because I had someone say to me, "Oh, I put everything off in December, and I just caught up with stuff." And then I said, "Oh, I'll do that in January, And then I didn't realise that January is now here, and I've got everything to do like in the first week of January. And I'm like, yeah, I think we're all the same, really, aren't we? So, yeah. But yes, it is New Year.
Oh, I started yesterday morning. I was doing school training, some insect training. And it was so dark, and it was the night before, and I got Flossie out of bed, and I set my alarm wrong. Everything went wrong, and I walked into the school playground just on time, which is later than I'd like to be. And as I stood in the school playground, I saw a car go past backwards with nobody in it.
It's not yours.
And
please tell me it wasn't yours.
No, it wasn't. And I stood there totally just, that'll be a car going backwards across the playground on, there was a bit of a slope on the playground. And I watched it. I genuinely just watched it crash into another car and thought, well, that's just exactly how I feel, isn't it? The beginning of the year. So I had to go in and I had to break the news to some poor people that their cars had crashed, and that was like, and there was tears, and it was all not very good.
Did you apportion blame as well? Did you say, well, it was this car that actually just rolled back?
I took photographs, and I was just giving it what for. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, fabulous. The podcast, I'm very excited actually about this podcast because I think this was a really unusual one because I'm not sure what we were expecting. Because it was about, but it turned out to be an absolute blast.
Yeah, it did.
If you can remember it.
What I remember. Now, bear in mind, we recorded this on. I was looking actually because I saw the last date we spoke, and we recorded it at the beginning of December.
It was the 12th, no less.
Yeah, the 12th of December,
which is a long time ago.
Yeah,
a lot has happened.
But it was a good one. It was a cracking one.
We did have good fun. It was Dr. Katie Hunt and Dr. Helen Rodwell, and they've written a brand spanking book, An Introduction to Autism for Adoptive and Foster Families. So, shall we just crack on it and let's put the interview on, and we'll try and remember what we said and when we were back then, when we were young and happy.
Yeah, before Christmas, yeah.
Back then. All right, good. So here we go. Here's our conversation with Dr. Hunt and Dr. Rodwell.
Press play now.
Now. There you go. Now. This stupid boy. Hello, Dr. Katie Hunt, and hello, Dr. Helen Rodwell.
Hello.
I don't know which is which. When I'm listening, say hello, Dr. Katie?
That's me.
That's me. And hello, Dr. Helen.
Hello, I'm Dr. Helen.
Yeah. I'm going to use this as a show reel for when I apply for a job in radio.
I would.
Yeah. Then you're sure to get it. I have complete faith.
Excellent. Quids in. Excellent. Cool.
Maybe like the graveyard shift is yours.
Yeah, the Alan Partridge shift on Radio Norfolk. Anyway, enough of my frivolity. Thank you very much for coming on to the podcast, and we really appreciate you giving your time. And well done for writing a book. More power to your elbow for writing a book. So that's massively impressive.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
firstly, because you are on, I mean, primarily you want to sell a book, aren't you? Well, let's be open about that. You want to sell a book? Is that your...
Well, we want people to know about the book because we're aware that there's very little written for foster carers and adopters about autism. So yeah, we want to sell the book, and kind of let people know about it.
Excellent.
Oh my days! Just keep them on the screen a minute. I've got to do that.
Okay,
keep them on the screen a minute. Yeah, there you go.
Come on, Kate, Dr. Katie.
Yeah, there you go. Right, cool, got it.
Smashing. But I have to confess that I was given a copy of the book to give away in a competition for the podcast. But someone who shall remain nameless, Emma Mortimer, a friend of the show, threatened to kill me if I didn't give it to her. So I've had to give it away to her. So that was a really rubbish competition. But we'll worry about that. Anyway, so that's my preamble. So Scott, you're going to start. You've got some questions.
Yeah, I do. Well, we've got a number of questions. We've got some from us, and really ours are, like Al said earlier, quite basic, really. And we're going to start from the position where we actually don't know anything about it, which wouldn't be unusual really in this community because there's so many kind of different labels that are placed on children. So really, the first question is, what is autism? What is it? Simple question.
Okay, do you want to do this, Katie? Shall I?
I'll try. Not that simple a question, really. There are different ways to think about it. The way that we think about it and the way we talked about it in the book is as a neurodevelopmental difficulty. So it's a diagnosis that children and adults can be given, but we don't necessarily think about it as difficulties. It's a set of differences that people have. Really it talks about autism describes three main areas of difficulty that people might have, or areas of difference that people might have. And I think as clinical psychologists we struggle often with that difficulty and difference. We don't want to imply that a difference means a difficulty. It often does, but it doesn't have to. So those three areas are social communication, social interaction, and rigid and inflexible thinking and behaviour. So most of the things that people with autism have fall into those three areas. Does that help? Does that, if you guys are kind of starting from not knowing that much, is that a good description? Is it a good enough description?
I think it describes it quite well from from someone who really does. I'm not joking. I think we all have a perception of what it is based on what we hear and what we see in the media and stuff like that. But I don't think anybody really explains it that well. So I think that probably explains it in a kind of fashion that we'd understand it.
It's a hugely wide spectrum is the thing that we would say. So there are people who psychologists might describe as classically autistic who struggle to interact in a typical way, who have very rigid, fixed, inflexible interests, may not have language at all, right through to people who, any of us might have a diagnosis of autism. There are lots of people who have families, jobs, do really, really well.
Yeah.
But happen to have a diagnosis of autism because it is a really broad spectrum.
Yeah.
And that can be a real difficulty because when you talk about autism, as psychologists, we know, that's a huge spectrum. But for kind of people who aren't specialists, it can be quite confusing, I think.
Can I ask what the prevalence is in the sort of the general population versus your book is specifically adopted and fostered. So what's the prevalence in those different groups?
I think, I've had a search to see what's the prevalence of autism in the looked after population, and actually, local authorities they're not good at recording.
Right.
Actually, like who has this diagnosis and who doesn't. Like, for example, the publication Children and Young People Now.
Yeah.
Okay, they kind of publish different bits of research and articles about, obviously children and young people. And they talk about actually a parent did a freedom of information request last year asking local authorities, how many kids who are looked after actually have autism. And the results that came back was 13% of councils didn't even know because they don't even record it. Some local authorities said actually none of our looked after children have autism, and then other local authorities actually said a lot of our children do. So actually, in terms of prevalence, I'm not sure people really know. And part of it's because perhaps because the data is not being captured, but it's also because it's about how that label happens or how that diagnosis happens. So, for example, for children going through the looked after system, they might have a medical, but it might not specifically look at a neurodevelopmental difference or disorder that might be going on. Medicals tend to be more care plan driven or educationally driven. So until difficulties become kind of obvious in a particular way, then these assessments don't happen.
So what is it in the general population then? I mean, to your best knowledge?
I think general population, do you know?
It's about 1.5% to 2% of children, I think. That's kind of it's really difficult to estimate prevalence, but that's a kind of, as you've just been talking, I've just been looking it up.
Oh no, they're all busted.
Sorry.
At least you admitted it.
Yeah.
Be fair.
I did admit it. So it's about kind of 1.7% of children, I think, is a kind of good UK estimate.
Right.
It depends on what diagnostic system you're using, and it's very complicated.
Yeah. And there's an issue with boys versus girls. So if you look into the prevalence figures, more boys will have the diagnosis, and actually that's been really challenged now in terms of actually how do girls who might fit the diagnostic criteria, how do they actually present when they have autism, because it's different. So they've still got these differences in these core areas, but they might not be so classic or not so obvious. And people talk about masking, kind of learning, so almost like learning a set of social behaviours or a way to behave to look kind of neurotypical and not get noticed.
Okay. Just going back.
We used to think it was about. We used to think it's about one girl for every 4 boys, but we don't think it's like that now.
Scott, you've got a question.
No, it wasn't a question really. I was sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Katie, but it was just going back to that spectrum thing, because I think that's a really interesting thing and something I'm hearing more and more of, not just with autism, but with FASD and kind of others. It's just I think the word spectrum and what it means is a fascinating thing, because actually we could potentially all have traits of autism in us, potentially. I'm just saying, but actually that doesn't. But we all sit at different, and it's like OCD, isn't it? I'm using OCD as quite an extreme, but it's something that people always refer to, isn't it? If they need to line up their pencils, or they can't bear something being out of place or something like that. I think that that's a spectrum as well as to how severe it can be. And I think that spectrums. I think it's great that we acknowledge there is a spectrum, because I think that that one size fits all diagnosis isn't. Yes, you may have this, but actually you could be at one end, or you could be in the middle, or you could be at the other end. I
absolutely.
think that's really quite an important thing.
Well, I think it is important, and I think it's also being aware of the different environments that people are in, what the different social expectations might be.
Yeah.
So you might be seen in one way in one particular place, but then in another culture perhaps, or even in a different environment, you might be then seen as more odd. Or is not kind of conforming to to how we socially communicate, or how we be social, how we do friendships, how we do relationships.
I think the whole idea that we all have things about us that are autistic is a really interesting one, because we still hear professionals talk about autistic features, which is something that is really unhelpful, because we all have autistic features, if you like. I can tell you all the things about me that I like a certain way.
I can tell them too.
If they're not right, then everything feels wrong. And I think everybody can relate to that.
Yeah.
It becomes autism when you've got lots of those things clustering together into those areas that fit within a clear diagnostic criteria, and really importantly, where the history supports this being a neurodevelopmental difference. So if you had a child, say, who ticked along, developing quite typically until the age of 7, and then developed lots of obsessional behaviour and social communication difficulties, we probably wouldn't be wanting to go down a road of saying this child is autistic, because there's nothing in their history that would suggest that they were different. Because when you ask parents or carers of children who end up with a diagnosis of autism to think back on them as babies and young children, they're different. They're really quite different from typically developing children. At the time, it's quite difficult for parents and carers to pin that down, but when they look back, they can see lots of things that were odd or different.
Yeah.
Odd's quite it's not particularly a word, but it's quite a good way to describe some of the things that children who end up with a diagnosis of autism have done, or how they've behaved.
Yeah.
And then picking up on Katie's point, that becomes a complexity when we have looked after and adopted children. Often we don't have, we might not have that early history, or we might not be able, we might not be able to talk and gather histories from birth family and birth parents in such a straightforward way. Yeah. Or that child might have moved between different places, so information about their development has kind of got lost, or kind of gone astray. And so I think that's probably another reason why we can have children in the looked after system where we don't know if they have autism or not.
That links into
because you haven't got that information.
Yeah, that sort of links into my question. Really, is that when I spoke to someone who I was doing this podcast, and they kind of said, well, but why? Why do we need a book that kind of focuses on looked after and adopted children? What is the unique factors that adds into the autistic issue?
Well, I think one is difficulties, challenges with good formulations and good diagnostic thinking about young people. Yeah,
when you say formulations, I'm just kind of I'm thinking of people who perhaps are not familiar with that language, including myself.
Okay.
Imagine that she's got an I know nothing. It's not a stretch.
Well, that's surprisingly easy.
Well. Feel the burn. Oh.
Yeah, we'll have Helen.
Sorry, I've been reading too much of your Twitter now.
Yeah.
So I formed this whole kind of persona for you.
Yeah, I do find that people.
You're probably right. You're probably right in how you.
Well, I don't know. I'll kind of reserve judgment. I'll keep gathering data, and we'll see.
Yeah. People do feel quite comfortable being rude to me, so don't worry. I blame Scott. I blame myself.
So we talk about formulation in the book, and clinical psychologists and other professionals working in mental health can think about people and their differences or difficulties, if you like, taking either a diagnostic approach or a formulation approach. So a diagnosis really is about looking at does someone fit a set of criteria, like a list of symptoms or a list of observations, which are in the two main diagnostic manuals.
Yeah.
And I've got one here. I'll show you. So this is ICD-10. So this lists every mental health diagnosis. It's a really good read. So if you ever want to just
it is not a good read.
If you have insomnia, this is the book. This will really help.
Yeah.
So diagnosis is really just looking at, do you fit this box that's been defined as, these are the things that you need to show or not show. Whereas a formulation is really about, I guess, trying to tell a story about this person. So thinking about, where's this person coming from? What's happened to them? You know, what was their early history like? You know, how have they developed? And what are the differences or difficulties that are going on right now? You know, what's kind of perhaps might be reinforcing that, or, you know, what are the protective things, what are the things that are helpful? And then really through that formulation approach, it's really thinking, okay, well, you know, how has this person got to this point? How can we understand it? Because then that gives us more clues about actually what can help and what can kind of move things forward. So it's more giving more of that, you know, background and the picture about who that person is. So for example, for a child, you might say, okay, this child has got a diagnosis of autism. All right, okay, we might all know what autism means. You know, we're using the same label, the same term. Or we might say, this child has got difficulties with how they interact in the playground with children the same age. So in a way that's kind of saying what the problem is. But we'd want to add in, okay, well, where's that young person coming from? So what did they learn about kind of social interaction growing up? You know, what were their early attachments and relationships like? You know, so they haven't just arrived at the problem in the playground. Over time, what skills, so how have they developed in their, you know, ability to kind of connect and form relationships and cope with all the stuff that's going around them in the playground? So that's probably a really long-winded explanation of formulation, but you get the idea that actually this is about telling a story, understanding that person.
Yeah.
And formulation and diagnosis can go together. So the diagnostic approaches, so that the manual that Helen was kind of showing, that there's a bigger one, there's the American one.
I've got that one too.
I'm impressed. There are lots of problems with them, and lots of people don't like them. Lots of professionals don't like them. They don't like the basis on which they develop. They don't kind of tie in with kind of big pharma and all that kind of stuff. So the diagnosis is problematic, but it can sit within a formulation. So we might say this child's got difficulties with social interaction, but only when these things are happening. But actually, we best understand this child as having a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. So we want to use all those things together. Because if you had 10 children with autism, you'd have 10 children with autism. They might not have anything in common other than they have a label of autism, because it's such a broad spectrum. So the formulation's really important in helping people to understand. So what does that label mean for that person? And part of the difficulty also is that if you have any one neurodevelopmental condition, you're quite likely to have another one. So lots of children have autism and a diagnosis of ADHD. Children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder can have all kinds of other diagnoses as well. And, you know, it's possible that reflects our criteria just not being very good. So...
You've given me already. I'm like at capacity now. I don't know about you, Scott. You've given me enough to think about for a long time. So Scott,
we'll do a part two. We'll do a part two with all the other questions that come up.
We've got lots.
I'm actually I'm quite up to speed with this for a change. So it's all good. Thank you.
All right.
Yes, Al, for patronising me like that. So typically,
I love you dearly.
Well, no, not typically. So what sort of what would because this is going to sound like a silly question given what you said, but I feel that we have to ask it. What sort of things would we see from a child? So what would it look like within a child? The three different kind of parts of the spectrum. So, at the very far end where it's quite, I don't want to say low, but that's what, on the lower end of the spectrum, then the middle, and then the high end. What sort of stuff would we see in terms of what autism looks like? If that's a question you can answer, sorry.
Yeah, so there's no real severity scale, except we would talk. You would know someone who was much more, I don't know the right way to talk about it, much more disabled by their autism. So lots of people with autism don't have language. Right. So it's not that they don't communicate, they don't have language to communicate. Some people with autism have language, but they don't use it, or they don't use it in the typical way. So a child might have quite a lot of words, but not use those words to get their communication needs met, because this is a social communication disorder. We don't like the word disorder, but that, you know, if we're talking about the kind of diagnostic category, these are social communication disorders, because they, you know, that they really get in the way of children and grown-ups' social communication. So someone who's got really severe difficulties and no language, and might have learning difficulties as well, because obviously it's complicated by having other conditions, might be really hard to reach, might have lots of challenging behaviour because they can't communicate and they can't get their needs met. They might have lots of obsessional behaviour. Somebody who at the other end of the spectrum may have just as many difficulties or even more difficulties in everyday life, because they still have a social communication disorder, but they might function really well. There are lots of people with, you know, degrees, really high-powered jobs who we would understand as having a diagnosis of autism, and some of those people are quite open about that, and others aren't. Some people, you know, get a diagnosis of autism way on in adulthood, and then they look back at themselves and can see all the things they've struggled with. Lots of children girls in particular, who struggle to attend school because they are overwhelmed with anxiety. They can't manage those what can be very difficult and complicated peer relationships with other girls in a structured setting. And, you know, lots of those, well, not lots, but a proportion of those children will drop out of school. They just become what are called anxious non-attenders, kind of hideous term. But actually, these are children and young people who are too anxious to attend school and just unable to function. So they might have very high level language skills, might be extremely bright, because IQ is, as it is in the general population in people with autism, people can have really marked learning difficulties or have really high IQ. So it's not that they've got, they're not able to, you know, they have language and they have very high level skills, but they're disabled by the social communication aspect of having autism. And very often it's about anxiety. There's a really good set of books which we talk about in our book.
See what you did there.
Alice Rowe. Back to the book. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think what they're called. The Girl with the Curly Hair series, which is all about anxiety in very high functioning young people, children and people with autism.
That becomes a really complex issue, doesn't it? Because I know that, and you know as well, Scott, with your work, is that we often, as a community of foster carers and adopters, we say that is a real pinch point for a lot of children, that sort of 12, 13, 14, going into high school, for a whole range of things. And do you think there's an element of us just looking at the symptoms and calling it out wrong?
Do you mean saying it's something else when it's actually autism?
Yeah,
or saying it's autism when it's something different?
Well, either way, I think.
Yeah. There's a real difficulty for children and families and young people of kind of finding the right people who can help them to work out, you know, what on earth is going on. Families really, you know, often really confused. Young people are really confused. Schools are really confused, and people tend to look at the behaviour in front of them and kind of deal with that rather than trying to look behind it. And one of the things we try to do in the book is about trying to kind of give some of what we would be doing as clinical psychologists and saying, okay, so this is what you can see, but why do you think that's happening? What might be going on behind a child who's having a meltdown? You know, it might be really high level of anxiety that they are just unable to manage. That has, you know, gone along with something else that's happened. But it's really difficult for families and children, young people, to actually have someone to help them through, you know, to do that looking behind. And that comes back to what Helen was talking about formulation. That's about, you know, trying to work out what on earth's going on.
And I think it's interesting. I think, like in the foster and adoption world, obviously, there's a lot of focus on attachment and attachment difficulties and styles, and quite rightly so. It absolutely should be a good frame of reference. But I think sometimes what I've noticed in my work is that is.
Honestly, we do this every few months. He sits in that room with them 3 clocks, and they go off at certain points. And look at the time; it's 21:39. Whose clock chimes at 21:39? Seriously.
Oh, it's just lovely. It's like it's triggering so much.
There'll be another one in a minute.
Warm grandparent memories for me. Yeah, it's just gorgeous.
There'll be another one in a minute, and then another one will go off as well. I promise. And you would think you would just click the mute thing, because there's a little thing that you can click, and he's not technically challenged. He knows how these things work. So
seriously,
anyway,
seriously, I'm trying to build a career here.
What, in selling clocks?
Oh.
Boom, boom.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll talk really fast then before the next chime. Okay. So what I was going to say was so just talking about in the foster and adoption world is a lot of focus on attachment. So people have this attachment lens, think attachment styles, think attachment disorder, and they think about attachment difficulties. And I think that's a good thing. But I think the risk is that sometimes that becomes the main or the only way of understanding a young person's differences or difficulties. So what Katie and I are really wanting to encourage is, it's just, it is a wider focus, is to really think child development, really think, what else, what could be going on, and that there is, there's always a possibility for something neurodevelopmental, something going on, which may not have been picked up on before or understood in that way before. Yeah,
I mean, I was reading that just before we'd started recording about attachment and autism, and I just thought, I mean, attachment feels very hip and trendy in this world, but one of the questions from Sarah Curie was the confusion between autism and attachment disorder, which is a phrase I really hate. Anyway, attachment disorder, what is that? Is it even? Is it it's not my understanding of how you would phrase it. But then it goes on. So what is the confusion between autism and attachment? What is the unwillingness to diagnose autism in favour of attachment? What is that? Something does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of adoptive families that I'm working with, I've struggled with. I think, absolutely is an overlap. So Heather Moran, who's worked on looking at, what are the same core differences or difficulties that do you see in children with attachment difficulties, or attachment trauma. They can show the same core differences as a child with autism. So, for example, they can both have differences or difficulties in how they get along with their peers, or how they cope with transitions, how they manage changes in the routine, or kind of showing rigid behaviour, such as lining up toys, things like that. And I think to tease that out, it takes a real time, and I think it takes a real skill in knowing about both things, but actually not even just knowing about attachment and autism, but also knowing about, what are the other neurodevelopmental things or child development things that might have gone astray, or that might be going on here. So I think it's kind of, in a way, it's a little bit of a false dichotomy to think, is it either or? I think it's, they're very much intertwined anyway in terms of these differences. But it's about looking, doing good assessments to look at that, and not only sticking to one lens.
Yeah. So
if you only look at attachment, I think you'll miss something. And if you only looked at autism, then you'd miss something as well. And I think in terms of that reluctance, to diagnose, I think diagnosis has kind of pros and cons to it. It's helpful in some places. It might access services. I think in terms of adoption support fund, I think if you mention autism, if you ask for an autism intervention, then you wouldn't get it, because they'll say, we don't do autism interventions. It has to be adoption related or attachment related.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know. Yeah, so I'm sure, I'm just guessing. I'm sure there's going to be an impact on that in terms of how people then kind of describe
Frame
things or
things, yeah.
label things. But I think, certainly in my experience, with people who want to get a diagnosis or seek one out, it's often because they believe it's going to help their child receive something or help open an avenue. So there's usually a good motivation for wanting to have a good understanding of their child.
It's fiendishly hard to get good assessments. So if you're a parent or a carer of a child where you think there's autism, even if there are no attachment issues or no attachment trauma kind of history and no looked after kind of history, it's fiendishly hard to get a good assessment. It can take years. And I find it amazing that it takes that length of time. So these assessments, so for autism, for example, it takes hours. So there's a complicated history of development to take. There's observational assessment to do. There's direct kind of play-based assessment with the child. There's interview with parents. That, one professional struggle to do all that work. But what we have is children being seen in kind of different bits of service, so by a paediatrician and a speech and language therapist and a clinical psychologist, but sometimes a year apart. So the first bit's out of date before the third bit's happened, and different areas have different processes and systems. There's no kind of standard way that you kind of move through the pathway. And what we end up with often is one professional will see the child for half an hour and say, I don't think it's autism. When actually it's far more complicated than that. Once you add in attachment and all those other difficulties, some of it's about the time involved to actually disentangle all of that. Because one of the things we argue for is that we should be doing assessments of children, not assessments of autism or attachment. Look at the child and look at the child in context of their family, their carers, their history. That's the kind of road to go down. But it's really hard and it's really expensive because it takes so much time. And so that there's that reluctance. Some professionals will not want to say it's one or the other. Well, of course, it can be both at the same time, plus other things as well.
You've painted I'm from that world. We're both from that world, and we kind of understand that often these children are like plates of spaghetti. Where it ends, where it starts is just incomprehensible, because we've not even mentioned trauma. We've briefly mentioned FASD. We've not mentioned developmental trauma. We've not mentioned chronic sadness. We've not mentioned separation, loss, all of the stuff that's kind of the bread and butter of our children's lives, isn't it? That's a horrible expression. But it was interesting you talked about this idea of a formulation. That feels much more safe for our children, rather than just going to a list of things wrong and going, oh, we'll pick that one or we'll pick that one. Because, I think I've probably told the story. One of my children in 1 year got 3 diagnoses from 3 separate individuals. We got FASD. No, we didn't. Sorry, we got reactive attachment disorder, which is, the trump card of all attachment disorders.
That's a biggie. That is the one to have, isn't it?
Yeah. I pull that out in special occasions, high days, holy days, that sort of thing. ADHD and autistic traits. And I kind of I agree with all of them and disagree with all of them. Because I think actually so it's bonkers.
Part of the difficulty inherent in that is the autistic traits bit. Because if you do an assessment of autism, let's just put aside all the other stuff. If you're doing an assessment of a child and you're looking at whether there's autism, if you don't have enough ticks in enough boxes at that point in time, you will say this child doesn't meet the criteria. And people will hear this child's not autistic. When actually, if you have a formulation based approach, it's actually this child's got social communication difficulties and this is how it manifests itself. It doesn't matter whether that child actually has enough ticks or is 2 ticks short in the autism kind of assessment diagnostic criteria, because actually you would still understand the child as having social communication difficulties. And any professional knows that social communication difficulties is shorthand for autistic, like an autistic child, probably autistic. But for the child, it doesn't matter.
But also, you're talking in a situation where we don't necessarily have that history. I have,
no, that's right.
And if you're a foster carer, you may have limited, even as an adoptive parent, the amount of history I've got over my children is. I don't have those necessarily be able to comment on those developmental milestones. I can't tell you what I can't tell you about any of my children before 3 months. Most of them before 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So you're kind of stabbing in the dark. I'm going to move us on to some questions because we've got lots of questions. If people can be bothered to ask questions, we should be bothered to ask. You should be bothered to answer them. If we're going to get all nasty with each other, and this is how it's going to go. You haven't mentioned your book in ages. You're doing very poorly. I'm going to tell Stephen Jones that you were. Oh, that
yeah,
one.
I know. Is this a JKP? It is a JKP, is
yeah,
it?
Stephen Jones.
Publishers, yeah. I'm going to message him now and tell him they're not doing a very good job.
Yeah, very poor.
Sales are going to be down, Steve.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Okay. Let's look at some questions here. In the book, do you cover FASD and autism? Are they similar, or can FASD mean an autism diagnosis is more likely? Is there a causal link, or do they just look alike at times?
Well, that's a big question. Not that one, Dr. Katie. We shall have a go.
We do mention FASD. It gets a small mention because it's not a book about FASD. Is it autism? No. FASD is FASD. If we're talking about formulation, then they're going to overlap. The kind of clinical difficulties that children with autism and children with FASD might have might be similar.
Yeah, I think particularly for for social, the research is that particularly for social interaction and communication difficulties, there's similarities between AFSD and autism. I think it tends to be less repetitive behaviours. But again, I'm saying that really carefully because there'll be some children who do. There'll be some children who will show those differences.
And we don't understand yet huge enough about FASD. It's relatively, and as a large spectrum, it's relatively new. We used to talk about fetal alcohol spectrum.
Yeah.
But now we have we used to talk about fetal alcohol disorder.
Syndrome. And now it's
the spectrum. So we are on the start of a journey. So I don't think we can really answer that question very well.
Yeah, and I think it's also it's trying to pull out, well, what's the impact of alcohol upon a fetus at different ages, different stages of gestation. So I think people who know about FASD would be aware that if there's exposure to alcohol at a certain point when the face is being formed, and that's when you're going to get the differences in how the mouth looks. But actually, I've worked with plenty of children on that spectrum who they're not showing the facial features because their parent was in rehab at that moment, and so was not drinking, but was drinking at other times, and so there's really kind of quirky, complicated things going on.
Yeah.
And it's
FASD is a massive spectrum, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because personally, and I've shared this before, so I'm not sharing anything that I've not done already, but for us, there is no record of any alcohol misuse. But that doesn't mean anything, because alcohol isn't something that's really picked up on. It's drug abuse, and it's domestic violence, and it's this and this and this. Yeah. So,
and also it's socially accepted, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's socially accepted.
Yeah.
So, I'm aware of when I was pregnant, 10 or 12 years ago, it was okay. Oh yeah, it's okay to have a Guinness. It's okay to have stout. And you kind of think, whoa, really?
Exactly.
But that's so.
But I think it's important for us to recognise that there's no association between alcohol and autism that we know of. I mean, I think and our parents and grandparents probably drank quite a lot during pregnancy because things like stout were good for you, but actually prevalence rates are rising.
Yeah.
So I think it's very complicated, but I don't think there's a link. We don't recognise a link between alcohol and autism.
Okay.
I think that's really good to know, actually. I really do. Oh, here we go. 2154.
2154.
My days,
Oh,
honestly.
you do
Honestly,
realise
I work with
you do
such
realise that
professional people.
I can mute that out of the conversation, but the fact that you keep talking about it means that I have to keep it in. You do
So it just
understand
shows
how
that
this
you're
works.
not organised at all. Here's me sitting in my little podcast studio, with silence, door shut.
But you know what? I think you should keep it in, because in the other podcasts that I've listened to, I've never heard the bell, so I wasn't prepared for them.
Oh, really?
Oh.
So,
No, I think we've had one very early on, actually, that was in. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's.
This is podcast gold, this, isn't it? This is fantastic.
I tell you, this will be in the outtakes. You
Yeah.
watch.
No, this is going right in, because you may be doctors of stuff, but you're not doctors of podcasting, are you?
Oh, dear me.
I'm going to sulk in.
Scaring the guests.
I'm going to sulk in the corner while you talk about things. Scott, you've got a question.
I do, yeah, and I'm just trying to remember what it was, because you've just distracted me, Mr. Coates. Thanks for that. So in terms of, because we're all about adoption support, so that word support means quite a lot to us. What sort of support is available for adopters and foster carers, special guardians, kinship carers for autism? And I guess the big question: how do they, how would they access some form of? I don't want to use it. Well, yeah, the word is assessment. I know that's the word, but where would they start in terms of looking at potential for their child to have autism, and how would they get support with that?
Okay, well, I think I can talk about the Adoption Support Fund first. Obviously, that only covers kind of England. Does it cover Wales now? I'm not sure if it does. I think it might do, but it does now. No, it doesn't. No. Okay, I'm always in hope that that's changed and it's more widely available.
I think we are as well, to be fair.
Yeah.
Should be all 4 nations, to be fair, but there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of ASF, as far as I know, like today, you can request kind of clinical psychology assessments. So you can ask for more neurodevelopmental assessments.
Okay.
Which obviously would have that wider lens. I'm aware by saying that obviously Adoption Support Fund, the criteria and what you can apply for and what you can't, it seems to be changing quite quickly. And there's things on there which appear and then kind of get taken.
He decides.
Off there.
He's the one with the decisions. He makes, don't you, Al? That's what you got your MBE for, wasn't it? The ASF.
Shut up. No, my understanding is that. Shut up. I'm going to still speak to my agent when this is all over.
Yay! I might get a new co-host.
My understanding is that because in theory a specific autism assessment is available through the NHS, in theory, that you can't then the fund is quite specific in that it won't duplicate things that are available. So if you ask for a holistic assessment of your child, like a formulation, give me a formulation of your child, then potentially autism would be then highlighted as well as whatever.
So if you went for a clinical psychology assessment of someone who's going to use a formulation, then that is going to pull out if there are differences or difficulties going on in the kind of core areas of autism. Okay, and they may or may not give that a diagnostic label. Obviously, the risk with just going for a single professional assessing is that you might miss all the other bits that you want to check. So the speech and language bit, and having a good paediatric assessment so you can rule out genetic disorders or other things that that might be going on. So ideally you'd want to be going through the NHS, but obviously that's going to be dependent on what's available in your area. So some areas have really good services, you can get through to them really quickly, whereas in other parts of the country, UK wide, the services have got long waiting lists, or they've got particular criteria, or they only see a particular age child. So it's a really hard question to answer in terms of where people go. And I think this is one where if you're looking after a fostered or adopted child, it really is about talking to your social worker and really putting pressure, I think, on your local authority to say, look, we've got a real need here. Because it's local authorities who then can commission services or look at actually what's available, what are the generic services that are available.
Yeah.
And there is clear, nice guidance on what an autism assessment should include.
Okay.
So it doesn't necessarily say who should do it. It talks about what professionals might be involved, but it does set out what the elements of it should be. I know nice guidance isn't kind of, people don't, it's not followed to the letter, but it does give a good kind of outline of what things should be in a good assessment. When you're thinking, is this a child where the difficulties or some of the difficulties could be autism? But it's going to be a multidisciplinary, if not a multi-agency thing. If you're talking about fostered and adopted children, because people are going to have to talk to each other. Health and social care don't talk to each other, particularly around children and kind of child development. They're very kind of separate pathways, aren't they? So if you might end up in CAMS, you might end up going through a paediatrician and a child development route, or a paediatrician and a speech and language therapy route. It's so different across areas. I mean, I'm based in Nottingham, and I know even just kind of in all the local authorities around me, it's really different.
It's really helpful to know that, though, because I think often the carers and families and adoptive parents and parents in general, if you tool them up, then they're able to kind of turn the cogs and apply the pressure at the right points. So, but what about peer support? Are there good networks out there that people can hook into?
There are good networks for autism. So the National Autistic Society has local groups. There are groups like Autism East Midlands. There will be other groups in kind of voluntary sector groups in other geographical areas. If you typed in autism support in the town where you live, stuff would come up. There's a really healthy community of people looking for support and kind of providing it. It might not be exactly what people want, but it's always a good place to start. Yeah. If you meet other parents who are having similar difficulties, the power, that's just so powerful and so helpful.
Mm-hmm. I'm aware that we're using up a lot of time, and you are very Larry, the pair of you. This has all got very
Larry. What does that even mean?
Larry,
it's mulled wine, isn't it? It's the mulled wine they've been drinking.
Yeah, it's the mulled wine. It's the Dutch courage you're taking. I do have a question, which is kind of hooks into the world that I'm quite involved in.
If it's Al's question, you're going to be here all night. Go on, Mr. Coates.
Okay, so I've been doing a lot of work with families who are experiencing violent and aggressive and challenging behaviour. And there's quite a strong, and I'm been using my words really carefully, so forgive me if I use words that are not helpful. But there's a high prevalence of challenging behaviour from autistic children. But what I'm kind of really nervous around, and what I've seen is some people saying, "Oh, well, that's just inevitable. That's just the way it is. That's what autistic children are like," which I'm really uncomfortable with. That sort of joining those dots. What's your take on that kind of those two elements and how they're linked? And is there a prevalence? Is there a number? Is it a quote? Over to you. You're the doctors.
I think if you put any person, autistic or not, in the wrong situation, you could end up with challenging behaviour. So any of us put in the wrong situation. For lots of children with autism, they're in a situation that's, I'm not going to say it's the wrong one, but it's not conducive to not showing challenging behaviour. Yeah. So I'm aware, there was a tribunal judgment, wasn't there, which I think is probably what you're talking about, which said that, a child with autism, their challenging behaviour was part of their autism, which I think is difficult. Challenging behaviour is about communication. Communicating something isn't right. Anxiety is a good one to talk about. It can lead to kind of lots of really difficult behaviour from autistic children, difficult in the sense that adults think it's difficult. These are children communicating that they're not managing. And as adults, we should be looking at, looking behind the behaviour on show and saying, I wonder what's going on. I wonder why this is happening. But adults don't do that. Adults look at what's happening in front of them and say, this is unacceptable. You've got to stop doing it. If you don't stop doing it, there'll be consequences. And those consequences can be really challenging for autistic children or children with any kind of neurodevelopmental difference. And we might view it as challenging behaviour, but it's actually just communication.
And it's a sensory bit as well, isn't it? So when Katie talks about anxiety, it's about thinking of children with autism have massive sensory differences. So you might think, well, this is a nice room and it's really calm. But for that particular child, it might be they can hear the water going through the pipes and it's driving them nuts.
Yeah.
Or that light is just at the wrong frequency, or they can hear the cars that are coming up and down the road. And so just because we might see it from an adult perspective of, well, actually this is the perfect place and it's all calm and and I'm managing it really and I'm approaching them in a way that's okay. It might be seen very differently or felt very differently from a child, for a child with autism.
We see some of that in what happens in some schools where children are put in calming rooms, which are seclusion rooms. I've had a conversation in the last couple of weeks with a parent talking about it, and it makes me want to cry because it's awful that's our response to a child showing difficult, challenging behaviour. We put them in something really aversive rather than saying, oh, I wonder why this child can't cope.
It's really interesting because I'm reflecting on a conversation we had.
I think, as adults, we've got lots to answer for.
In the podcast, we spoke to one of my friends, Colourful Carmen, that's who she is on Twitter, and she talked as an adult. She's just had a diagnosis of autism, and she's in her 40s. But then she reflected on her own childhood and some of her behaviour, but it was all precipitated by this lack of understanding and this response to her behaviour that was then just pouring petrol onto a fire, consistently, reinforcing her anxieties, her stresses, her lack of communication or inability to communicate. Also, that kind of chimes with what my hunch is, but you clearly you've got a really good measure on that. Scott, any more final questions?
Well, I was just going to say, I find this absolutely fascinating because, simply for the reasons of, when I was at school, which was only 5 years ago, 30 years nearly.
Boston.
I'm just thinking about, all those children where these things weren't prevalent, were they? We had no professionals who could actually sit down and say, well, actually, do you know what? There is nothing wrong with you. It's just that you have a condition that affects your. I love that phrase you use, social communication, because that's quite a key thing. Because not every, it's like we box everybody up to be the same, But actually, we don't all look the same. We don't all act the same, and I just the more we talk about some of these. I don't want to use the word conditions, same as we use the word disorders. But when we're looking at these conditions, they're actually just part of that person, in effect. And it's how we, as the majority that don't have that same thing, how we deal with it. So when we look at education, massive issue for most adopters. But why is it a massive issue? Because a lot of these children may have some of the traits that are kind of assigned to all these conditions that we now know about, but 30 years ago it just wasn't there. And I think that's what struck me throughout this whole conversation, is really about how intelligent the human race has become, and going, actually there's something in that, and what is it, and why does it happen? And I don't know if you guys feel exactly the same. Al, why are you shaking your head at me? Am I being too thingy for
No,
you.
because you're waving scissors in the air.
You're waving
Oh,
scissors.
sorry, yeah. These are the scissors that actually my 12-year-old.
Oh, it's like challenging behaviour.
Yeah. After we've been in play therapy, he went to play therapy today, and they were playing with bandages. So I'm assuming they were doing that bit about what you do if you're hurt or something. And he came and got the scissors, and he was cutting the bandage off his hand. I was like, no, don't do that.
What could possibly go wrong?
I'll put them away. So yeah, I don't. And there's the bells. 2209. But yeah, I don't know how you guys feel about that. I mean, how do you? Just briefly, sorry, because I know we're taking up too much of your time now. But how, is that how you feel about it, or is it kind of just something that you've spent your careers doing?
I think I got really distracted. I think.
You know what? We should call that the Theresa May chimes.
For whom the bell tolls.
Yeah, well, it did.
Just not go
Until
there.
about an hour ago, yeah.
Interesting.
I liked what you said about identity, because I'm aware that there's lots of adults who got diagnosed with autism. Either they've always they've had it from childhood, they've had it later, and they talk about, actually, this is just who I am. Yeah. There's lots of debate. There's lots of debate on Twitter about, well, do you say like John has autism, or is he autistic? Even like labeling it. People say, well, actually, it is actually about identity, isn't it? It's just about how you can't, in a way, you can't separate autism out. It's just who you are. It's just how you interact. And it's just how you perceive and experience people and the world. And I think Katie touched earlier on about, well, do we say it's a disorder, or do we say differences? People with autism, just like anybody else, can have amazing strengths.
Yeah.
And it's all about, if you're in the right environment, then our strengths come out, don't they?
Yeah.
Our abilities come out. But actually, for any one of us, if we're put in the wrong place, a lot of us can struggle, or would crumble, or not quite show our brilliance, or show, how calm we could be, whatever quality you're looking at. Yeah. So I think that's it. Yeah, I think it's actually a good thing that we've got this spread of people who are different, and we're not all the same.
I think
actually we could recognise it.
Yeah, it's important that we recognise that for some people, having a diagnosis of autism explains lots of the things that they have found really difficult, and is helpful. For lots of people, it's unhelpful. There's a huge stigma attached to it. But there's some lovely research which kind of taps into some kind of, the identity of people with autism. And people talk about, I don't have a disorder. There's nothing disordered about me. I'm different from you. You're neurotypical, if you like. And I'm not. And I think that's really important that we hold on to that it's not although it is a disorder, because that's the kind of classification system that we talk about. That's why we talk about it being a disorder. But it can be hugely positive for lots of people as well, to understand how they tick and how other people tick.
I mean, that's a positive note, isn't it?
I think we've ended it on a high, actually. We do, unusually. And I think that there's this risk with us, because we always say, we'll have to have you back, and we never do. But we need to follow up on this. No, because it's true, we do. We've said it to many people, because we never have it long enough. But we know that our audience only like about an hour chunks of our voices. So, that's fine. We get that.
And we'd be happy to come back.
Yeah, exactly. And we will revisit all of this, because I think what's interesting is that, within the space of 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, things can move so fast. And we only have to look at things like FASD to understand that has just, moved on so fast in the last couple of years. So, I mean, I feel quite informed, actually. Mr. Coates?
Well, to be honest with you, I'll fess up how this all started. Really, was that I was approached by Jessica Kingsley and asked to read the book, and
you can read, so how did they?
Well, I get my children to read it to me. No, and I thought, do you know what? I know nothing about autism. And I thought, I genuinely know. All I know is I've seen Rain Man, and I know that it's which. And often people talk about social workers not knowing about things, and I thought, well, I need to get up to speed. So I thought, well, that'd that's a bit of serendipity. Read the book and thought, actually, this sounds really cheesy. It sounds really convoluted.
Yeah.
I read it and I went, that makes sense. So it wasn't.
Yay!
Well, it wasn't
Hey,
like.
well, that's our mission accomplished.
Oh my days! Now you need to put that on your next print.
No, I think you'll find that it's already on the.
ME, is it?
It's already on
What
the
does it
back
say?
of the book.
Oh,
So it is.
Yeah. So So I think. I mean, I'm looking.
that's how you felt, Al.
Yeah. So I would say it is a great book, and if you wanted to know about autism, and if you're a social worker, read it. If you're a social work student, read it. If it's just on your radar and you need to read it, I would get it because it's an easy read. It's autism for people like me, not very bright. So
We tried to write it so it was accessible, so that parents could pick it up, professionals could pick it up, young people could pick it up.
Yeah, if you could do a picture version for Scott, that'd be great.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm not even going to deny that. Unless it's a true story, I don't read.
Well, maybe even a cartoon flip one.
Can I have pop-ups as well, please?
Pop-ups, yeah.
If you're listening, Steve, from JKP, a pop-up book for Scott would be fabulous.
A whole range of pop-up books. Anyway,
I don't have time to read. What are you on about?
No,
it takes me to read your text. Never mind. No. Anyway,
we're bickering like an old married couple. Dr. Katie, Dr. Helen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for inviting
us. And an eye-opener.
And have a cracking Christmas, even though this will probably go out after Christmas. That's complicated.
Wrong. Theresa May. Oh,
you're just making it into editing hell now, aren't you? I hate you guys.
It's always a challenge.
Okay, then. Well, I shall say goodbye. Goodbye.
All right.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Nice chat.
Bye.
So there you go. That was the interview with Katie and Helen. And I have to confess, Scott, I did think it was going to be a bit dry, and I wasn't too sure. But they were a right laugh, weren't they?
There's 2 podcasts we've done where you've not been sure, and this is the second one of them. I'm not going to tell you to say what the first one was.
Can't remember which one that was.
Shall I say it? Does it matter now? No, it does, because you said it on the podcast, actually. The NVR one, you weren't too sure about that one either.
Oh, yes.
And then you weren't too sure about this one. And I was actually dreading speaking to them because I was thinking, well, if Al's not into it, then, how am I going to... Because obviously Al's much more intelligent than me.
Oh, no, it's just a facade.
Yeah, well. But they were a right giggle, and... well, it's quite obvious they listen to the podcast as well because they were able to laugh at us.
Put it straight back at us. And they knew their stuff as well. Clearly, if you've got a doctor in front of your name, you must know what you're doing, or maybe bought it, perhaps. No, that's a harsh.
Well, I think what impressed me was the fact that they were willing to kind of accept a challenge, but actually had a very good kind of response to that challenge, if you like.
And yes, so but I think in the podcast I said that I'd actually given away, because Emma Mortimer came up to me, friend of the show, Emma Mortimer, and said, "You've got a book on autism, I want it." And her being a forthright woman.
Forthright? Do you mean she didn't come blindfold you, stick you in the back of a van, and then just take it off you?
Well, there was a bit of that going on. And actually, so I turned up and I gave her the copy that was to give away. But then when Dr. Helen found out, she said, "Oh, I'll get you another one." So I do actually have one to give away.
Oh, isn't that lovely?
It isn't that lovely. So we need to think of a competition to give that away.
Yeah, I've got a competition question. We'll do it at the end, and then that's fine.
All right, have you? Oh,
yeah.
What's Scott's favourite colour?
I'm prepared tonight.
You are P for prepared. So, tell me what you thought about that interview then. What was what do you take away from it?
Well, what I took away from it was that it's a spectrum, and it's very similar to a lot of the things that we talk about, isn't it? So FASD and autism and various other kind of things. I guess to some extent things like ADHD as well. And what I was impressed about was the fact that they accepted our challenge and replied to those challenges, because I think it's sometimes too easy just to label children with conditions that they might not have, or that might have the same kind of what's its name? They might manifest it the same way that trauma might, and all that sort of stuff. So so that for me was quite interesting, because the longer I talk to doctors and hear about kind of some of the challenges that they face and some of the diagnoses they get, the less kind of surprised I am by those diagnoses, and wonder, is that really what the underlying cause is? So it's made me rethink that in a way. But I'm still not 100% convinced, I have to be honest. But I see what they were saying and why they would say that. But yeah, they seem to kind of know the background of these children, and they were willing to accept that actually sometimes there are misdiagnoses when it comes to stuff like that. So.
But I think that they kind of acknowledge that, and the discussion around formulation versus diagnosis, I think, is really helpful. And I think that, a diagnosis can be really helpful, because it's a, well, for your children, my children, I know that it's a piece of paper that you can kind of say to people, no, actually, this is a real thing. This is not just me being an over-anxious parent, or me just being a whatever sort of parent. But but that doesn't...
Whatever kind of parent.
Whatever kind of parent. That's a fancy social work term I learned when I was in university. Briefly. But I think the idea of formulation is actually much more helpful to kind of make it, which gives an explanation rather than just a phrase. And I know that that's something that I've seen written several times recently, and actually it helps people to understand this narrative that children live in. And you could call it one of three things, but actually this is what it means for that child, regardless of what you call it. This is how they see the world and how they see themselves in it. So I find that really, really interesting. I'm sorry about all the chimes through the podcast as well. Oh my days, was there? What have you done tonight? Have you covered them all up with towels or something? No, actually, someone's turned them all off. Because I learned a trick off Zippy that if you lean grandfather clocks forwards, the pendulum stops. So I've gone round and done that, which is really odd. But if I say, Alexa, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? I'm glad I've got my earphones on, because
It looks like there will be clouds with a chance of showers, with a high of 6 degrees and a low of 1 degree.
Alexa, shut up. Oh, she did. That's excellent. That was like that.
Let me try something.
Okay.
Alexa, who is Al Coates? She says, I don't know who he is.
Oh, you're Alexa. You've got Alexa as well.
Yeah.
Oh, this has gone.
Yeah, it's my Alexa.
This is podcast. This is not podcast gold. I'm telling you.
It is.
How should we give away this book then? What's your plan? What's your current plan?
So my competition question. So it's first person to message us with. Are you ready for this? Because it's going to be really difficult. Yeah. So pens and papers at the ready to message us and let us know what our joint. So Alan Scott. What is Alan Scott's favourite biscuits?
Oh, that's.
Told you it was a cracker, didn't I?
That seems appropriate.
Is it bourbon or bourbon?
That means we can just give it to whoever we want. You do know that, don't you?
Yeah, it does. So whatever. Eh?
Podcast gold. And if they DM us that with their address as well, that would really help.
Well, or we could always send it by pigeon, but an address would be good. So but don't do that publicly, please, because we don't really want your mailing address posted, and we'll get someone to fund the posting of it as well.
Yeah, or I'll send my kids with it.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah,
on their bikes.
Oh, yeah, that's actually the other bit of the prize, isn't it? The other bit of the prize, you get to look after our kids for a week.
Yeah. Yeah, a blessing, an absolute blessing. Did you have any fun and games over Christmas?
Lots of fun games, I would say.
Well, I had a brief interlude with a police officer, which was quite interesting, because one of my children was. Do you know the phrase "working their ticket"? Is that a phrase you use? Oh well, it's in a kind of a northern phrase where someone works their ticket. Is like if they're just pushing it. So you'd say, they're working the ticket. Right. So one of my children was, and to protect the innocent, I shall not tell you who, was working their ticket. and was refusing to put their seatbelt on. So after a long evening, which involved the shoes being thrown around car parks, a flat battery, having to jump start a car, eventually on my way home with a child who still refused to not put their seatbelt in. As I got to the end of my lane, there was a police officer in a car just doing whatever he was doing. So I thought, stuff this. Pulled in, said, "Hello, would you be able to talk to my child?" They were refusing, so the police officer went, "Why, sir, of course I would." So he gave them a right rollicking, and they put their seatbelt in. That was the end of that. Then I thought, that was freaking awesome. I'm so glad there was so well done, police officer. Thank you. There you are.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Well, that's different to the normal kind of ways you interact with the policeman, isn't it? So,
yeah. Well, no, I think
you approached them this time.
Oh, shut up. You promised you'd never mention that in the podcast.
Oh dear. Well, we just had an interesting couple of weeks. This is all I can say, really. Just an interesting couple of weeks. There was no highlights, I wouldn't say. There was no lowlights. It was just your standard 3 weeks in the same four walls with the same people.
That sounds really
ready
tricky.
To kill each other by then.
Anyone for a game of Monopoly?
Exactly. Or shall we just go and kill each other now? Yeah. It's all good. Yeah.
Oh, it's good. It's good. And what hopes and aspirations have you got for the year?
Quite a few. Going to be honest. Got lots to do this year. Not just work-wise, although that is going to be rather busy. I have to find a new home.
Yeah.
By May. So we're off to look at some houses next weekend. So that's exciting.
Very.
And obviously I have my upcoming nuptials.
Oh, yes. And I have to say to you, you do know that you haven't invited me to your hag weekend.
Yes, I do. On purpose, because
I was talking.
I've invited Lady C instead. She's your stand-in.
Yeah, she was saying to me,
more likely to enjoy herself than you will. So
we were watching telly, and she looked over at me and she went, "So, me and Scott have arranged." And it was this awkward pause. I went, "Well, it wasn't awkward because I went, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to go out drinking with Scott."
Oh my days! Imagine I'd be on the floor in 2 sips with you. Well, do you know what? I thought actually I'll be nice to you, but that does mean that you've got to make up for it in some way, shape. Well, I've told you what you've got to do anyway, because you've got to host a weekend, haven't you? But secondly, yes. I've got high aspirations and high hopes for the actual wedding day, so you best be sorting. Was that a big sigh that I just saw on the screen? Did you just sigh, or were you panicking? I don't know which one that was.
I meant to think the sigh. It came out. It'd be fine.
Yeah,
It'd
so
be
I've got
fine.
high hopes for everything else, but yes, I thought that was a little bit unfair to expect you to come to the location, the venues, and enjoy a big jolly gay weekend. And I thought Lady C would enjoy it instead. And to be fair, within an hour, she was like, "Yep, I'm all sorted. I'm coming."
Oh, she's packed already, man.
I bet she is. It's not till April. She's pacing now, isn't she? She's like, is it yet? Is it yet? So yeah, but I thought that was a bit unfair to expect you to do that. So so you've been let off the hook with that one, matey.
That was good.
See, and I told you it wasn't a traditional wedding, so there you go. See,
the
best man doesn't have to come to the stag do. So yeah,
excellent. All bets are off. Well,
although I have heard about Triss's. He knows nothing about it, but I know all about it. And all I can say is mine is going to be rather tame in comparison. So,
I know what I know about his ones, and what happens there stays there. That's all I know.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so we've got a busy year ahead, I would say.
Excellent. And what
about you? What's your aspirations?
I want to get more. I want to get more adoptees on the podcast. I want to get more of the voices that are kind of slightly.
Why do you always have to make it sound like you're this martyr? I want to get more adoptees on the podcast. What? We both do that, but you didn't say what's your aspirations for the podcast, did you? You say what are your aspirations. So I told you my personal aspirations,
which was around
what
drinking.
Are your personal aspirations.
My personal aspirations. You've really got me there, because I'm not sure I've got any personal aspirations. Just survival is kind of a really.
Why I bother with this one?
If I could have anything,
another axe.
Yeah, another axe. Actually, do you know what? Today I got receipt of my Christmas present to me, which was a foldy bike. which means nothing to you.
Oh, really?
A red Brompton, which I am.
I know what that is. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is like the dullest podcast. Two middle-aged men talk about bicycles that fold. You came here for
Anybody who
autism.
knows will love it.
Yeah, it's podcast gold.
They've heard the autism.
Yeah,
They've heard it.
if they've survived this
But
long.
it is beginning of January. By the time summer comes, we will be back on it, or spring even. We've only got 6 weeks till spring or something.
Oh,
haven't we?
it's a
So,
wonderful thought. 9.
yes, it is.
But we're
Yes.
going to speak to Julie Samuels, who's going to talk about digital, all things digital and adoption, which is an interesting podcast. I thought, because it brings some challenges and it brings some good things. We're hoping to speak to someone about DDP.
We are going to speak to someone specific about that, actually.
Yeah.
And that's Joanne Alper from Adoption Plus. She's going to come and do that with us.
Excellent.
After me wrestling her to the ground last night and getting her to do it.
Excellent. So she's confirmed. That's good news. I have to say, I didn't do too much on Twitter, but my high point was when one Jessica Kingsley Publishers, who I'm buttering up immensely, said any titles people want to hear from next year, and I thought this is just gold. It's like all of the stars have aligned, and I finally got to say my hobnobs and a cup of tea.
Yeah.
I was chuckling about that. Hobnobs, cup of tea. One adopter's descent into madness trying to get an ECHP plan.
I did like that. I have to confess.
Yes.
Social media hasn't been my thing this last 3 weeks. You might have noticed. But I did see that. It did pop up in my timeline when I was checking one night. And that did make me chuckle as well. So well done, you.
Thank you. I'm here all week.
You'll get an award for that. If they do awards for Twitter quotes of the year or something like that, National Adoption Week Awards, something like that. Yeah, you'll be there.
Hey, shall we call that quits then, and we'll get ourselves off? I've got things to do. I've got
No doubt.
I don't know. I've got to go and have a conversation with Alexa about what's the best route into London tomorrow, because I'm going to the DFE. But anyway, that's another story.
Enjoy.
I shall.
I'm not, so.
Excellent. I'll enjoy then. We'll all enjoy. Have a smashing week, and I shall speak to you soon.
What's black and white and red
That's
all
fine.
over?
Oh,
An orca in a bed
she's telling me jokes.
Why is she telling me jokes? Alexa, why are you telling me jokes?
Sorry, I'm not sure about that.
No, you're not, because we didn't bloody ask you, did you?
Teeth.
Oh, well.
It's like
So there's now 3 people in the podcast. Al, Scott and Alexa.
Yeah. Alexa, subscribe to the Adoption and Fostering podcast.
Sorry, I don't know that.
Yeah. It doesn't show up in Alexa for some reason. I don't think Amazon...
Oh, that's it.
Yeah.
That's the end of that. Well, on that note...
Amazon don't do that. Yeah. Anyway, right. Have fun, listeners.
Yeah, have fun. Stay well. And don't forget the competition. Bourbon or bourbon.
Yeah, bourbon or bourbon.
Okay, bye.